Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of First Corinthians. Today, we're going to be hearing from Paul to the church at Corinth, and the first thing that he's going to do in chapter 7, we're going to be reading 7 and 8 today, and the first thing that he's going to do in chapter 7 is really kind of go into detail, talking about marriage, and more in particular, more specifically, he's going to be talking about who should be married and advice to those who are married and even advice for those that are not married and a lot of different situations in between. So that's what Paul is going to cover really with the church at Corinth in chapter 7. So he begins with just kind of some general instruction. So the argument that they're having is it better to be married or to not be married? And so the first thing that he does is he explains some advantages of marriage. For one, as he says in verse 2, it prevents immoral actions and attitudes. As he says, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. And it is also God's will for many people to be married. And because it says in verse 7, for I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man that hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. What he was saying by that is, it's an advantage for him to not be married, but it's not the same way for everyone. Not everyone was meant to live a life of being dedicated completely to God, and a life of celibacy is what Paul was committed to at this time. Well, not just at this time, that's what Paul was committed to for his life. And so then he goes into talking about the advantages of remaining single. So for the most part, a single person is free to devote all of his or her attention to the work of the Lord, having no need to share time with a spouse or children. And I think you could probably easily see why that could be significant or could even be helpful for a person that is trying to serve God with their life. When you have a spouse, you have to dedicate time to them. You have to dedicate love to them. You have to dedicate lots of things. And that's just the way you're supposed to do. That's how God tells you to care for someone that you are married to. And so it's naturally, it's going to take some of that time that you could spend doing whatever God has called you to do for him or for his church. So if you could stand not being married, Paul has said that it's a good idea to not be married. But if you can't, then you're better off to be married. And the reason this is so important to the church at Corinth is because there's kind of two main views that are going around at this point. And the one is that sex doesn't affect your spiritual life, so you can do whatever you want. And the other is that sex is sinful and is to be avoided as an activity of Satan. But Paul is basically having to tell them, no, neither one of these are true. It was something that was designed by God for the marriage relationship. And so if you're a person that is married to someone, that's something that God blesses and something that God encourages. But if you are not married, or if you could stand without being married and without doing that, then you don't need to be. So Paul is saying that, we all have different gifts. We're all called. We're all different. And so if you can stand to not be married, not have a spouse, then it may be better off for you to live that way. And so then comes the matter, which is best. And of course, it depends completely on God's perfect plan for each believer. So God's will has to govern any decisions that you make concerning marriage. And he says that in verse 17, but as God hath distributed to every man as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. So Paul is saying that God ordains different things for different people. So God's will must be what decides, should you be married or shouldn't you be married? And the next thing he says in the very next two verses is that pleasing God is the most important part of it. If your marriage is not going to bring honor to God, you should not be married. You should not get married. If it's not going to help you, it's not going to encourage you, then you should not get married. And then the next thing that he says is, we are not our own, but have been bought and paid with a price. And so that's something to remember. And that's really, you can see that in verses 20 through 24, really, where he's talking about how we belong to Christ. We have been bought and we've been paid for with a price. So that's something to think about, in that we're not our own. Okay. So it's not all about maybe what we want. Maybe we might want to be married, but we're not called to be married. And that's definitely countercultural to our world today, where it's like there's a perfect person out there for everyone. Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but there's no shame in not being married. There's nothing wrong with not being married, because it does allow you to dedicate yourself more completely to whatever God has called you to do in your life. God has called each of us to do different things, given each of us different gifts that can be used in different ways, and we all kind of have different requirements because of that. And so then the last thing he says in verses 29 to 31, and this is really important: even if married, Christ must occupy first place in our life. And so he says then in verses 29 to 31, but this I say, brethren, the time is short, it remaineth that both they that have wives be as though that have none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they not use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. Everything that we do in this life is going to pass away, and because of that, what we can do for Christ and what Christ has done for us needs to be number one. It needs to be more important than anybody, any relationship that we have. That's what Paul is telling this church at Corinth. Yes, it's important that you love your spouse. Yes, it's important that you take care of your spouse. Yes, it's important that you dedicate yourself to them. But we need to dedicate ourselves to Christ first, so that we can dedicate ourselves properly to our spouses and to those people that we are married to. And then he also gives some more specific instructions to specific individuals in those chapters as well. Like, for instance, for saved couples, Paul points out that they're both to submit their bodies to each other. You're not supposed to deprive one another for any reason other than in service to the Lord. If you're dedicating yourself to the Lord and depriving one another, that's okay. He says that both must agree if physical intimacy is set aside for a while to facilitate prayer and fasting. He said that specifically in verses 5 and 6. And he also says that both must strive to stay together and not divorce. I saw a video the other day that had a statistic that I think it said Christian couples were about like 50% of Christian couples end in divorce. And so like I was shocked, because the way he presented it was 50% of couples end in divorce. And then he said, and that's in the church. And that's what really stood out to me, because you would think that as God's people, especially saved people, two Christians together, you would think that divorce just would not be an option. But sadly, it is. And it has been, but Paul is saying this should not be. There should be no reason why two Christians ever get divorced, with the exception, and as we've seen elsewhere in the scriptures, of infidelity. That was the only reason that God gave. But then Paul also goes a little bit in a different direction for spiritually mixed couples, because remember, we are advised to not be unequally yoked. If you're a Christian, you're not supposed to marry a non-Christian, and for that reason, because it's not likely that if you marry somebody that's a non-Christian, it's possible that you will bring them to Christ. It's also possible that they will lead you away. And if their priorities are not the same as your priorities, you're definitely not going to be able to dedicate yourself to the Lord as you know you should be, and as God has called you to be. But the advice that he gives specifically to spiritually mixed couples, and you can find that in chapter 7, verses 12 and 16, he says that the saved spouse should continue living with the unsaved spouse, if at all possible. And the reason for that is because that action may result in the salvation of the unsaved person. It could be that maybe they will listen to their saved spouse when they would not listen to anybody else. But he also says that the saved spouse should allow the unsaved to depart if he or she insists on it. So, and he says in verse 15, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. So what he's saying, if you are unequally yoked, and if you realize that you're in that situation, and if the non-Christian person is the one that wants to leave, then let them leave, and you won't be held to that bond any longer. And so then he also talks about both virgins and widows, and he advises those that are unmarried not to rush into marriage. This is a serious commitment, and as he has already said, it's not really one that's for everybody. It's not necessarily for everybody. If you want to get married, and if God calls you to be married, then sure, you should be married. But it's not for everybody, and you shouldn't get married just for the sake of getting married. And then he also talks about widows in this passage, where he says that if you are widowed, if your spouse dies, then you are free to marry another believer. So if you want to look at that in chapter 7 of Corinthians, Paul gives lots of instructions to the church at Corinth on how they should proceed in marriage relationships, on if you should be married, and all those types of things. So make sure you do take a look at that, because a lot of that stuff is pretty interesting, and it applies to us as well today. These are good rules to live by, and good rules to follow as Christians in marriage relationships, or that hope to become in marriage relationships in today's world. And so then we get to chapter 8. So for the next 3 chapters in Corinthians, Paul is going to deal with the subject of Christian liberty. And he's going to start here in chapter 8 by talking about food that's been offered to idols. So the confusion there in verse 4, it shows us, is it right for a Christian to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols? Now, we have to make sure we realize that there are many idols, all of which represent gods who don't exist. Okay, so they're sacrificing foods to these idols that don't exist. So, okay, it's what it is. And there is only one true God, the creator of all things and the giver of life, as he says in verse 6. And in light of all of those above, there's no connection between food and spirituality. So is it okay to eat food that's been sacrificed to idols? Yes. Why? Because those idols don't exist. They're not real. They're not beings. They don't exist. So somebody sacrificing to them, it's kind of not that big of a deal. He does warn, however, that not all Christians fully realize this, and some are upset when other believers eat such meat. So his instructions in those circumstances are to not become a stumbling block to other Christians. And we've heard this before from Paul to the church at Rome, where he talks about not becoming a stumbling block to our brothers or sisters. And he says in verses 9 to 11 there, to do so could be a sin against your weaker brother. And then in verse 12, that if you do it and it's a sin against your brother, then it's also a sin against your Savior, which is obviously not a good thing. So what we don't want to do is cause someone else to stumble with something that could be avoided. Okay, that's kind of the thing to realize here. If we remember in Rome, or we remember earlier, Paul had said that he can do all things, but that doesn't mean he should do all things. Kind of the same idea here. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And if you doing it causes your brother or your sister to stumble, or it's going to tempt them to stumble, or is going to kind of push them down a wrong path, then you shouldn't be doing it either. And it may not be sinful for you, but it could lead to something sinful for someone else. So that's something that we have to realize as we make choices in our everyday life. As we think about things, like the things that come to my mind are, say, like drinking, smoking, watching things on TV with inappropriate language or violence or things like that. Are they necessarily sins? Maybe not. But are they things that we should do? Probably not. That's what Paul's saying here. If it's going to cause our brother or sister to stumble, we've got a huge problem with addiction in our country. Should we drink? Well, I mean, some people can just have a drink and then they're done. Some people can have a drink and then they're never done. So For me, it's a lot easier to just never do it. Why? Because I'm not going to cause my brother or sister to stumble with something that I don't need to begin with. I'll stick with my Mountain Dew. And so that's kind of the idea here. If there's something that could be a stumbling block, something that could really hurt our brother or sister, that even if it's not necessarily sinful, we shouldn't be doing it. So if you have a question in your mind, if you're thinking about doing something and you're wondering, what should I be doing this? Run that through your mind. Like, could this cause someone else to, first of all, could this cause me to stumble? Second of all, could this cause somebody else to stumble? If the answer to either one of those questions is yes, then you shouldn't be doing it. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb there. So Paul says in verse 13, to wrap it up, "Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I'll eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend." So Paul says, if what I eat is going to make another Christian sin, I'll never eat meat again as long as I live, because I don't want to make a Christian stumble. And it's just that simple, guys. If there's something that maybe we want to do, but it's going to cause our brother or sister to sin, we shouldn't do it. And if that means we never do it again, then so be it. And that's what Paul is telling the church at Corinth here. So that's what Paul tells us here in chapters 7 and 8. I will see you guys tomorrow as we wrap up the book of Genesis.